I'll start the recording. Great. So welcome, good morning, maybe good afternoon for some, maybe even good evening, everyone, to this exciting session with Ryan Woodring. This session is part of the Art and Care series, where we share examples of best practices impacting society, through the lens of creating research and care ethics. My partner in crime is Elena. She's not here yet, I think. Elena Cologni, she's an artist and senior research fellow at the Cambridge School of Art. My name is Merel Visse. I listen to Merel too. I'm the director of the Medical and Health Humanities program at Drew University, and I'm also an associate professor at the University of Humanistic Studies in the Netherlands. And today we welcome Ryan. Ryan holds an MFA. I think most of you know him. He holds an MFA from Rutgers University. He's my colleague at Drew, where he serves as an assistant professor of digital studies. And perhaps you've read today's announcement where he describes his teaching practice as a guide for reciprocity, which is directly related to care and to the ethics of care, the field that Elena and I are very much interested in. So I'm so excited that you're here, Ryan. We had to postpone this, but it's happening. You were also part of the Cambridge study day that we had with the Art and Care sessions last April. And we listened to a taster of what we'll be hearing today. And I just wanted to mention too that, and I wasn't aware of that yet, but I read that yesterday, that in the past you were responsible for the visual effects on the award-winning film The Box Trolls, and you even co-founded a Freelo residency called PREC, if I pronounced that correctly. So great, welcome. So good to have you here. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Merel, and to Elena for having me. I'm going to begin sharing my screen now. So you'll be seeing my top bar. I don't know. Apparently I, have, despite using Zoom all of these couple of years in the pandemic, I'm still not great at sharing my screen. I'm on a brand new laptop as my, I'll address this later, but my 2015 MacBook Pro died in the middle of the library at the International Museum of Surgical Science, which I thought was a kind of interesting coincidence, to say the least. So I'm excited really about the community that Art and Care is fostering, and to be a part of that, and feel really fortunate that teaching at Drew, this really small, intimate campus, teaching art here, that amongst one of the, very few grad programs in the 2,000 student population is this medical and health humanities program that Merel is leading. And so this feels like a really nice, coincidence or maybe something beyond that, that we've been able to bounce off of these ideas off of one another and move forward with our kind of shared research. So I wanted to acknowledge first that because I'm coming in from Chicago today, I am currently sitting on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, the Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. And so I promised a lot of people who were coming today that I would be speaking about this new body of work. And it's a body of work in which essentially every day since last July, while experiencing an episode of an invisible, undiagnosed chronic illness, I've taken to the software Blender. It's an open source software, and I have basically 3D modeled the shape of that internal invisible feeling. And I'm now in the process of creating hard candies from those models. And so I figured I would just show a decent amount of screenshots to fulfill that promise right off the bat. So this is just a little bit of an entry point into the software for those who are unfamiliar with it. And the process that I use is it's called sculpting within the software. It's a kind of like a lump of polygonal clay that is a really malleable thing. So I've accumulated over 60 of these, and there have been days where I've experienced this chronic invisible nausea that I haven't been able to record this. And I've also lost a few of these models to failing hard drives, etc. But I currently am sitting with 60 of these models that I will be making into hard candies, and I'll be showing some of the process by which I've been doing that with the idea that those will be shown at the International Museum of Surgical Science in September, and that I will be selling the candies separately as well, with the idea of getting them into the hands of as many people and mouths of as many people as possible. So on the left here, you're looking at the UV map or the texture map. And then on the right, you're looking at the actual 3D model. And I like to kind of think about this as a kind of gift wrap. This UV map kind of provides the texture that gets wrapped around this model. And then this is the model itself is, just like this kind of this void of a mesh. Oops. And a lot of times these UV maps will end up kind of looking very fleshy. I also wanted to say, if people have questions as I go through, I'm more than happy to address them. And because I have a lot of really close friends here with me today and colleagues who I'm really grateful to have, I would love this to be a kind of more casual conversation. So whether those are technical questions or conceptual, etc. So I wanted to begin with this quote from an essay by Vivienne Delchamps called "A Slight Hysterical Tendency: Performing Diagnosis" in Charlotte Gilmore's The Yellow Wallpaper. And that quotation is, "This essay begins with the premise that diagnosis and cure are not always helpful or desirable. As someone who's struggled with 5 years of doubt brought on by having a condition that has evaded any helpful diagnosis, this is a really sobering, but in some ways a comforting line of thought." So while my presentation begins with this work in progress that I just scrolled through, I also wanted to address some of my primary artistic concerns over the past 5 years as I've grappled with reified selfhood, with productivity as an entrenched value system, and with finding alternative methodologies for visualizing and living with an unpredictable and invisible illness. So later in this essay by Vivienne Delchamps, she quotes the CRIP trans activist Eli Clare, who writes, "Cure requires damage, locating the harm entirely within individual human body minds. Operating as if each person were their own ecosystem, it grounds itself in an original state of being, relying on a belief that what existed before is superior to what exists currently." So while Eli Clare's quotation speaks on the violent normalizing of trans and disabled bodies, and Vivienne Delchamps' essay refers to the lack of agency historically and presently afforded women and female identifying patients or women identifying patients. I can only speak to my white cis male journey of clinical self and alternative searches for diagnosis. The other thing I find really fascinating about this quotation, or I'm really struck by here, is this conservative impulse towards treating the present as a lack. This is something that, of course, happens at a diagnostic level, but it also happens within the individual who's suffering from a particular ailment as well. Each illness has its own way of eating away at the present in a unique way. But this kind of initial turmoil of inexplicably being able to perform as yourself, for me, unfolded in this kind of confounding and ongoing trauma that has really found its way into my art practice, or trying to contend with that or subvert that in my art practice. And so at the onset of my condition, I actually became resentful of the kind of mirror, the image that I was getting in the mirror. I didn't feel like it was projecting the actual internal miscalibrations of my body. I felt like it was a kind of fake or a fraud. And it was as if I were, as if I'd become like a devout physiognomist, where I was like looking for these outward signs of my body's internal condition. Of course, I'm not actually a physiognomist, and there is a very troubled historical trend that has actually found its way into newer technologies as well, about trying to decipher someone's personality or their chance at recidivism, if we look at it through a criminal lens. So this traces back to the inventor of eugenics, Francis Galton, who would do these composite portraits, essentially trying to make a type, a stereotype of what a particular criminal would look like. So this idea of the individual being kind of consumed by the composite, the individual versus the aggregate, is something that I think continues to this day and finds itself a lot in diagnosis, right? In diagnosis, we're kind of constantly looking to match an individual's subjective experience with a kind of broader set of predefined experiences that, of course, can be treated. But I was thinking about this, my very first attempt to bring my internal condition to some kind of externalized image was actually through machine learning. And I had been working at a startup AI company called Playform.io that a lot of artists I know now have used. And thanks to Atif Akin and Ahmed Algamel, I was working there and I was doing data analysis for them. And essentially, it's a company that allows people with or without a coding background to do their own machine learning by collecting a large amount of photographs and then training a machine model on them to create new instances of that set of information. And so what I was interested in was, I was curious about, like, I had these two kind of distinct sets. I had this set of selfies that I had taken over the past, at that point, 3.5 years, that had really belied my internal condition, had kind of worked within the accruing social capital, or things that I had sent to loved ones, or dating apps, etc. But then I was interested in this like specific type of photography, the stock image, which works in a really, the capital that accrues through a stock image is very different. And it's a very kind of vaudevillian overacting of a kind of particular diagnosis. And so what I did was I searched for hundreds, thousands even, of these thumbnail images that appeared in a search for nausea. And then I added those to a set of hundreds of images of myself. and essentially did a machine learning process through which I tried to make a kind of hybrid body that would in some ways bring to the surface, perhaps bring to the surface this internal feeling while also having some kind of adherence to my self. And these were displayed on these very tiny 2.8-inch LCDs. So I wanted to bring up a second quotation here that's been really important to my thinking. And this is from the artist Carolyn Lazard from Health in the Mundane. Carolyn Lazard on the Malleable Body, and in an interview that she had at the Walker. Illness has affected my practice in deeply profound ways. Instead of trying to make art about sick people, I'm trying to make art that is sick in all of its material and formal qualities. And I think this quotation brings out this idea of moving beyond what illness looks like and thinking about what does it do. And I've thought about this a lot in my own work, this intersection of illness's representation and its embodiment, and trying to make work that in some ways is doing what I'm referring to. And so to go back to that series of machine learning that I was doing, I titled that series Generative Adversarial Nausea, which is a play on what is referred to as a GAN, which means Generative Adversarial Network. And basically, that is since 2014, it's a crucial part of machine learning. And essentially, it involves the machine trying to play a game of kind of deception with itself. It's a constant game of self-deception. There's one part of the machine learning that it creates new images based off of the original data set. And then there's the discriminator, which decides whether those images either adhere to the original data set or if they're kind of frauds. And it learns through this process. And again, I was thinking about that from a diagnostic standpoint and thinking about that is like a very, a kind of parallel condition that someone who's trying to figure out the legibility of a particular set of symptoms is going through, where they're kind of constantly testing, is this a consistent feeling that I have? Does it relate to this or that? So this kind of self-deception. And what I like about that body of work then is that these images, even though they're kind of fixed, they're static images, they feel like they're part of a kind of continuous process of undoing and rebuilding and self-deception. And another thing that I found kind of curious about these stock images, I'll just let this play as I speak, was this idea that these stock photos, the people in them who are feigning illness, like these really, again, like overacted illnesses, were often in these like incredibly moneyed spaces, like these really kind of like rich, sleek urban environments. And there was something about that made me feel like even in sickness, we're being kind of asked to hurry along the nausea, like to essentially gut ourselves so that we can continue to be productive agents for a particular set of values. And so what I did was I took the hybrid bodies that I was getting from my machine learning, and I put them back into these spaces from these stock images. And I essentially, from a technical standpoint, all I was trying to do was make this model essentially throw itself up, but through this kind of continuous, long, arduous process. And essentially, these characters end up kind of nestling within the furniture, the spaces that they're in. And by the end of this 8-minute video work, essentially kind of undo the logic of the spaces that they're in. I'll let that play for just another minute. Eva or Eva, I just saw your comment in the chat. Thank you for that. So moving on to my next slide here. I've been thinking about this premise of, does sick work ask to be cared for? If we think about work as being sick, is it being, or is it being asked to be cared for? And it's interesting, there's this magazine article I came across titled "Mona Lisa, Physician Diagnosis Solves Mystery of Enigmatic Smile." And in this, it's essentially this physician who was in line at the Louvre for so long that they had the opportunity to diagnose the Mona Lisa, the painting with all of these ailments. And I was just thinking about kind of how absurd that is, or thinking about this idea of like, this physician was in line at the Louvre for probably much longer than they would generally have the opportunity to visit with their patients and hear their patients out. And so in some ways, it's like this surplus of diagnostic knowledge that's just being applied to this painting. And this painting, of course, as we all know, like, has been personified in so many ways. It's been humanized in so many ways. There's a lot of, when people when people visit the Louvre, there's a lot of these video journals where they're saying, "I'm in the same room as her right now." So that quotation, it's basically like he's finding all of these different ailments. I'm looking at a slightly edematous, swollen woman with no hair throughout. That to me is a classic picture of clinical hypothyroidism or an underactive thyroid gland. But also at the beginning, they say like each of the physical abnormalities he spotted has a known medical correlate. And I was just thinking like, wouldn't it be so perfect? Like this is this idea that you can kind of diagnose everything on this perfectly static image. So it's of course easier to do that with something that doesn't move, but we as humans are constantly moving and evolving and changing. And we don't have physicians looking at us for that long. And also, I'll go to my next slide here to play this. So this is a work that I made that that looks at what if the Mona Lisa actually continued to age. So what if we were actually looking at 1,000-year-old person, right? So this kind of idea of a very slowly moving portrait that moves the sitter for the Mona Lisa into a kind of clinical setting. And kind of jumping off of this as well, one more kind of anecdote that I find really interesting about the Mona Lisa is there was this anecdote that prior to the room being painted a kind of deep navy blue in 2019, that she actually was surrounded by this room that was this kind of like tannish yellow. And there was this myth, this anecdote that every year the room was painted a deeper hue of yellow in order to offset the yellowing of the actual painting itself. And to me, that like speaks to the lengths that that we might go to kind of preserve the image of good health, these kind of hegemonic ideals of health, while kind of drastically changing everything surrounding it. So again, moving beyond what illness looks like into kind of how we discover illness, how we diagnose illness, working, I did this performance score that I thought was like a really simple score, and it was just to go onto the Met Museum's online catalog and to search for all of the works that were on display that show up in searches for either sick or tired, and then to visit with each of those works. But I ended up, the results really were kind of fascinating, and ended up, I found a lot of kind of parallel movement within my search process of kind of self-diagnoses and what I was coming across in the museum. So first of all, this idea that a search engine kind of spits out these results, this aggregation of results from all these previous inquiries and all of these search engine optimizations, a combination of things being sold to someone and also helpful information. But then as, you know, as patients or as people looking for diagnosis, we are doing so in the real time of our lives, and we're having to ingest that in the real time of our lives. And so I wanted to do this performance that kind of spoke to the embodied knowledge or the embodied feeling of searching for something. So I came across all of these different types of work. Like I found this one work that was just like crystal, and it was made by Johann Sick. So that's why it came up in Sick. But then I found these other works that had reference to healing. So these stolen African objects that were you know, used in healing ceremonies that had then are now, as Arthur Jaffa refers to in the essay, My Black Death, are really just kind of their use value is being kind of stolen from them as they're forced to kind of sit behind glass in these Western institutions. And then I also came across these works that had on their surface had nothing to do with sickness or fatigue. And those works were really fascinating because I kept wondering, like, in what, like, why did they come up in my search? Like, who at some point in the metadata had diagnosed these as sick, and why? And would that diagnosis continue with this work of art for eternity? And there's this work, for instance, Madonna and Child with Saint Joseph and Angel by Raffaellino del Garbo. And I think that something that I find interesting in the writing here in the online catalog is, even though it doesn't refer to sickness directly, in that last sentence, it says the losses in flesh tones on the painting, or the losses in flesh tones on the Virgin's face have revealed the green underpainting below. And I was thinking about the kind of classic, the Mr. Yuck symbol, and thinking about green, like a green flesh tone as a kind of indicator of sickness. But I was also thinking about this idea that the underpainting below, the kind of vegetation state, the ruins, as this painting ages, the ruins that are currently behind all of the human actors in this will actually take over. And so in some ways, this painting kind of contains a time release trick where it ages towards this vegetation state, and the ruins themselves become the main actors as it ages. My favorite thing that came out of that though was when I came across there were certain things that came up in my online search, certain works that actually, when I came to them in the museum, they were in these rooms that were roped off or closed for the day. And so they became completely inaccessible. And I thought, you know, again, going back to this idea of illness and what it does as opposed to what it represents or representing it, I was thinking, like, that feels very much in line with a diagnosis of illness, that these objects would be allowed to rest. And I was thinking about that. So where I'm showing in September at the Surgical Museum, they have this library on the second floor, this medical library with all these really old books that are like all completely wrapped up, and you can't even see the titles. They of course have like an online catalog and whatnot, but I really kind of like this presentation of all these like neatly wrapped anthologies here. And the other really funny thing about this is when you're an artist in residence there, they sit you at this table, despite the fact that they have this big plaque that says, please do not sit here. And so you're kind of just like sitting there unexplained to everyone in this place. And if you're me, then your computer also, your 2015 laptop, the battery also implodes and your computer completely dies on the spot. So that's been my experience this week working out of the surgical museum. But I'm actually really excited to be showing at a place like that, because I'm taking my cues from this really fascinating book from Barbara Maria Stafford titled Body Criticism, Imaging the Unseen in Enlightenment Art and Medicine, where she looks at the age of enlightenment in Europe and concentrates on this fascination with both ruins and human bodies as these excavatable things that have these layers to peel away. That to find truth is to kind of dig for truth. So she writes, the impulse to make public the inarticulable and the concealed extended perception dimensionally, not only in the artistic sphere, but in the scientific as well. Indeed, I wish to argue that the latter set the example and provided the technical images and tropes for the former. The plumbline prolongation of vision was typified by Felice Fontana's production of deeply layered and thus excavatable polychromed anatomical waxes. Nowhere, however, was the penetrating gaze of the natural historian more mesmerically in evidence than in the discovery and the copying of the miniature visions hovering beneath the microscope's lens. And so on the right here are these images of these anatomical models that, again, they have all these different layers, and they are static and they can be peeled away. And it's like this idea that there's a locatable thing inside of this living object, and there's something about when something is inanimate, it becomes easier to excavate, which is kind of the same thing, the same logic that gets extended to ruins. And I also like this this print on the left here of someone kind of showing just doing like a kind of lifting up here of their skin in order to reveal their entire digestive system. And Stafford goes as far as to say that Giovanni Battista Piranesi, who was a kind of really big in the early world of kind of printmaking and these architectural renderings of these spaces of ruins, that he himself was probably influenced by these anatomical models. And so again, there's this idea that the ruin and the human flesh are both these things that are excavatable. And even so far as the idea of this as a print, as an etching, as something that where acid kind of comes through and brings and levels something to the surface is really important to that work. So again, she goes further in this to say that the 18th century struggle to pierce to the bottom of all the blurred visual signals, whether emanating from eroding ancient ruins or the confusing masquerade of fashionably covered modern bodies, seems to be fulfilled in 20th century transparent visualizations. Computed tomography, X-ray imaging, positron emission tomography, magnetic resonance imaging, and ultrasound now probe non-invasively, but publicly, formerly private regions and occluded and secluded recesses. And I wanted to quote here from Deborah Padfield, who is works in between art therapy and spaces of kind of medical humanities, primarily using photographs as a kind of transactional or an object that kind of helps mediate between patient and doctor relationships. And she quotes The Transparent Body from Jose van Dyck, who argues medical imaging technologies have rendered the body seemingly transparent, but we tend to focus on what the machines allow us to see, and we forget about their less visible implications. So when a patient's body is not performing for themselves in the way that they're accustomed to, it's at that point, it's kind of, they're asking their body to perform on a kind of, if they're lucky enough to acquire any kind of clinical care, which is not, obviously not a given in the United States, then they are asking their body to perform for medical professionals. And there's a way in which your body performs in that space. What we gain in this non-invasive passive viewing is actually a constant deferral of mastery. So when we think about like early surgery, and when we think about the idea of a surgeon as a kind of master excavator and master kind of technician, we actually, when you have a chronic illness or an undiagnosed illness that can't just be kind of located and stitched or pulled, or et cetera, then all of a sudden there's this like deferral. There's no immediate mastery that you surround yourself with. Instead, you're just in these machines that have been produced somewhere else with software engineers that were working remotely. And you, at that point, you are the kind of performer, you are the master of your own diagnosis. And a lot of times you're just being kind of asked to stay still. I still remember back when I played baseball in high school and I had this like tear in my shoulder. I was in an MRI machine, and I was so tired, you know, just from the average American high school student, just being so tired that in that machine, despite the fact that they were like blasting music, I like momentarily fell asleep and like twitched my whole body, and that essentially ruined the entire MRI. Like I was asked, you know, this idea of just being asked to be completely still, and I was failing to do so. The body is put further on display in this like hyper-connected app-based world where like health, sex, consumption habits, and all these other data points invisibly escape the individual, but they come back to them in the shape of foreclosed opportunities or perfectly targeted ads. And so I wanted to turn to another artist, Yo-Yo Lin, who kind of subverts and takes ownership of her own data and refers to it as soft data. So this is a book, a journal that she authored called the Resilience Journal, and now she sells and gives these away to other people with chronic illnesses or whatever, who essentially, and in this, you are defining your own categories and you're creating these graphic representations from them. And so she refers to this as soft data. As those who sustain an illness, disability, we often have a biodata footprint where our health is quantified by medical practitioners through various medical tests and procedures. Instead of just focusing on the biodata of our illness, I'm particularly interested in tracking the data that's usually overlooked in the experience of living with illness, the everyday, hard to grasp, soft data sets that are much more like poetry. This idea of a kind of fragmented self works its way into so many kind of contemporary conditions. And so Megan O'Rourke specifically speaks to the idea of autoimmune diseases and the philosophy that is kind of pulled to the surface when an individual is dealing with an autoimmune disease. The framing of an autoimmune disease is that the body is kind of at war with itself. And so it creates this idea, the immune system, which is supposed to identify the difference between self and non-self, as essentially attacking itself. And she speaks to, in this book, The Invisible Kingdom, she speaks to how with her specific autoimmune disease, like even when she sought alternative care, she was often being told that she wasn't living a kind of fully authentic version of herself. And if she were able to find that authenticity, that she could, you know, her body would essentially become this united front again. And that, of course, is a lot of pressure to put on someone who's dealing with this like extreme fatigue and all of these other symptoms, this idea that something is miscalibrated in their own life, that is in some ways like punishing them for that. So it's really important, I think, to be aware of that in this like health conscious moment where we're using all these apps and you know, to kind of track our own relationship with our health. This idea that it's not, that's a very kind of neoliberal concern, is that we take full responsibility for our health. Of course, I'm not against diagnosis, and I believe in the benefits of diagnosis a lot. And of course, I am still searching for my own. And I wanted to, one of my last quotations here is from Joseph Dumit, from this really interesting ethnography called Picturing Personhood, Brain Scans and Biomedical Identity. And in this, he is talking about patients who suffer from mental illnesses. They do not react negatively to brain images of depression or schizophrenia. Rather, the reaction to brain images is often one of care and concern, much more akin to the reassurance and bonding experience between parents and ultrasound images of fetuses. The brain image in this setting, the brain image appears in the setting to be an image of the suffering of the afflicted, as well as an image of the affliction. So this is what he's referring to here. And even though PET scans are in some ways a really, you know, that they're not like direct representations, that they're abstractions, right? But what he is referring to here is that someone who is able to see what their brain actually looks like and the kind of ailment that they are suffering from, you might expect that person to react negatively to that. But what he is actually putting forth in his ethnographic studies is that people often referred, you know, often felt like there was a, you know, that they had a caring relationship with that they were finally able to see this thing that had at some point kind of taken over their whole identity. And they were able to see it, like he says, almost like the way a parent might see an ultra scan of a fetus, this thing that is both of you, but not you. And so I wanted to, as I work my way back here to this project called Today and Possibly Tomorrow, I wanted to work back to that to think about why I was interested in creating these 3D renderings that I then print out as candies. This idea of taking this overwhelming feeling that takes over and actually providing a scale for it, being able to print it out, being able to see it as something that exists outside of myself, has been a very kind of like therapeutic journey. But I specifically wanted them to be digestible. I wanted them to be edible. I wanted them to be something that stood outside of myself, but also could always be potentially re-ingested. It could always lead back to the invisibility that originally generated it. And again, that refers back to this idea of making work that does something that feels sick, that feels, in this case, literally this, you know, these sugars could trigger my own kind of chronic nausea again. So it's this work that is both representational, but exists as something to be ingested. And I also wanted to, I saw a dear friend of mine, Mike Cotto, was in the audience today, and I wanted to give him credit for something he said casually one day when we were talking about this work, was also like, when you're licking a candy, you are essentially removing its specificity. So if you begin with something that has all of these different really well-defined nooks and crannies, as it's being licked, as it's being consumed, it becomes a more generic, generalized form. And to me, that actually does really speak to this idea of looking for diagnosis, thinking about the kind of details of your everyday and trying to create a generalized form that matches with some kind of pre-organized diagnosis and treatment. Let's see if this one, oh yeah. So this is a video of pouring into the mold here that are made. So there's two different approaches that I'm currently using for this. One of these is making molds. So as you saw from this 3D print in my hand is actually just a resin print. And then from that, I'm working with a fabrication team called Shison Wu LLC in Queens to make molds from them. And then I'm pouring this sugar in and then doing lots of different things with food dyes and whatnot. But I'm also working with a team in LA called Sugar Lab, who is printing directly the 3D prints with the textural information and with the color information already in it. And so lastly, just the three or four more slides of inspiration for this. The title of this series comes directly from Ankoara's Today series that he began in 1966 and worked on until a few months prior to his death in 2014. And these are also referred to as date paintings, but this idea of a kind of a ritualized relationship with the objects that we create. And speaking of ingestion and candy and remembrance, Felix Gonzalez Torres's untitled Portrait of Ross in LA, a work that everywhere that it is presented begins at the healthy weight of his former lover, Ross, who, as the audience attends and sees this work, is encouraged to take candies from it. This idea of kind of bittersweet remembrance of someone through a taste, but also as you're remembering them, you're in some ways removing some of that remembrance. But it's important to recognize that in the actual contract and the writing up of this work, that Gonzalez Torres encourages the institution to replenish the pile of candy kind of at their own discretion. So in that ways, there is this kind of care of continuously reintroducing new sweet moments for this person to be remembered. And then lastly, a mentor of mine from Rutgers University, Stephanie Jemison. This work was at the Greater New York show at PS1, and it's called Tumblers. And this is going back to what I was saying about this idea of as you eat away at something, it becomes a more it becomes like a more generic form or something. But in this case, actually, what's happening in this tumbler is that Stephanie is combining coins with all of this kind of industrial detritus that she's finding on the street. And as this tumbler kind of continuously rotates, the coins lose their value because they lose the kind of volume that represents them as coins, whereas the other works, the other industrial objects, actually become polished and they kind of accrue value, becoming shinier and having less blemishes, etc. So it's this idea of kind of equalizing or bringing a few things to an equal value place. So with that, I will say thank you, and I'm happy to, I'll close my screen here and then would love to just have, I don't know how much time we have, Merel, but a kind of healthy Q&A would be great.
We definitely have time for that, Ryan. Thank you so much for this rich presentation. I'm amazed by it because you seem to cover most of the medical and health humanities questions, like the basic questions, very well, questions that we've thought about for many years. And I was thinking, well, I have some questions myself, but I first want to open the floor to others.
Of course. Thank you, Merel.
Are there any questions, comments? Yes, go ahead, Lee.
Ryan, I really enjoyed your talk. I agree with Merel. I mean, I don't know much about the subject of medical humanities, but now I feel like I know a lot more, and I'm really interested in how you brought in all the quotes and references. I really feel like you made something for like someone like me who doesn't know much about this subject really able to engage with it.
Thank you.
I have a lot of questions and I could ask, but I'll just ask sort of a basic one. So I was interested in your idea about how you sort of address the external as one thing and then trying to represent the internal, that it's sort of more subjective and indescribable. And
Right.
and when you're making a work that ultimately is visual and externalized, like what's the challenge of like trying to put those kinds of ideas into something that essentially will be a surface?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Wait, I'm gonna, there's a lawnmower outside here. I'm gonna close this window. Okay. Speaking of external and internal. So I think that's the main challenge and why I'm interested in the process, right? And making works that feel like they can be kind of easily undone at the same time. So going back to that first series that I showed of the generative adversarial nausea, this idea of like, even though those are static images, they feel like they kind of hover in this like very, they hover in a state that looks like they could be resubmitted into this process of machine learning. And in fact, they could. Like, the way that machine learning works is that it'll just, you can continuously, of course, train to get higher degrees of accuracy. But in that kind of accuracy, there's all this kind of undoing that's happening. What I want to like also just point out that some of these things are, because I'm showing in progress work, even though I've thought about these things a lot, what I am kind of interested in is the way that a 3D model, a virtual 3D model, is actually kind of all surfaces, as opposed to these like earlier, as we were talking about, these like wax models that were made that are all about kind of excavation. The kind of current 3D model is an idea of kind of surface value across. And so I wanted to make these meshes that kind of, that's why I was interested in making these forms that were like trying to throw themselves up, that they were trying to like explore the kind of hollowness of that condition. And that's something that is also interesting to me from a kind of like cultural heritage standpoint, thinking about Swati, I know you're here, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Trinidad Rico wrote an essay about cultural heritage and how this idea of virtual facadism, that kind of anything on Earth can be captured by our new kind of photogrammetry and these new technologies that can capture things, but they're essentially just capturing the very kind of only the exterior information, and then that travels into some kind of disembodied virtual experience of the thing, but they're a kind of all surface thing. So that's something that I'm grappling with right now, and I think that's a way that like 3D modeling feels so much different from the materiality of the candies that are being produced now. So I'm glad that I'm kind of taking it to that step and that I can feel both things happening. Thanks, Lee, for the question.
Any other questions? Yes, Rory.
Hi. Thanks, Ryan, for the talk. That's great.
Thanks for coming.
So I guess I can't help but think of Susan Sontag and
Sure.
illness as metaphor and AIDS and its metaphors.
Yeah.
It feels kind of like she's doing something similar with language, what you're doing visually with illness. And essentially, you know, like Sontag had cancer when she wrote illness metaphor,
Right.
and essentially, you know, argues that the language around illness and cancer specifically increases suffering for patients.
Right.
So it feels like there's this relationship of kind of like power control, maybe, that like I think she's getting at. And I'm curious about how you feel about that relationship of power or control with your content.
Yeah, I that's a really great reference. And if I remember correctly from that, like with cancer, she's talking a lot about an externalized force that becomes a kind of monstrous thing inside of you. And that's why I wanted to bring up the Megan O'Rourke quotation about autoimmune diseases, because it's actually with autoimmunity, which is like the kind of the fastest growing kind of field of you know, of diagnosis that's, you know, that's happening in the United States and globally. Like there's still such a misunderstanding about like what the self is and what the immune system does, and is it actually like, is it actually attacking itself? Is there actually some kind of rupture there of self, where the self can't recognize itself in a way that makes it attack itself, which I feel like is so different historically from how diseases were thought of prior to autoimmune diseases, as something that is coming from an externalized source that enters the body and then creates its, you know, creates a home there, and with all of the effects that come from that. So that's something that, in terms of like what you're talking about with power, I think the power is this idea of a patient suffering from an unidentifiable, let's call it an autoimmune disease, like kind of feeling as if they themselves are to blame for that. That is a power that, of course, puts the agency in the individual, and doesn't speak to environmental racism, doesn't speak to the other conditions that are really generating a lot of this increase in autoimmune diseases. So I think it kind of, I think with so many things, it puts the pressure back on the individual. And when you're already the individual in this kind of fatigued state going through this, and that's like one less thing, or that's one more thing to kind of worry about, is like, am I not living my true life? You know, because obviously I'm at war with myself here. So I don't know if that answers directly, but I think that idea of where an illness begins, there's a lot of power in identifying where you think that illness begins. And if you think it takes root in the self, then again, you're like ascribing all of this agency to the self, to the individual, to kind of determine and figure out their own, you know, their own disease.
Yeah, I'm very interested in this question too, because in care ethics, we are thinking about a notion of the relational self. And, you know, we are always part of communities, and that takes away a little bit of the responsibility of us being, well, responsible, self, you know, this notion of being self-entrepreneurial. We always have to sell ourselves. Well, anyway, but I just wanted to confirm what you just mentioned, Ryan, that I agree that we should think of other models when we think about illness and disease too, for of the self and of what is personhood and so on. Any other questions? Yes, Swati.
You're muted.
Hey, Ryan, really
Hey.
great talk.
Thank you.
You were absolutely spot on with the cultural heritage reference.
Okay, good.
But I wanted to add another layer to it because, you know, as we fixate on the exterior, a lot
Yeah.
of what the intangible aspects of the thing gets lost in translation. And I think that it kind of echoes the weird game of telephone we often play when seeking a diagnosis, kind of going from doctor to doctor.
Yeah.
But I have a completely unrelated question, but on the topic of your candies, I'm interested in your decision of opting for a hard candy, because the final two quotes, one from Yo-Yo and one from Mike, in talking about soft data and the removal of specificity, I feel like a soft candy would kind of echo this kind of borderless, more malleable thing that you're talking about. And I
Yeah.
wanted to know, like, what your thoughts were on that, and, you know, how you made the decision to arrive at the final product that you're producing.
Sure. Yeah. I think with softness comes a kind of, I wanted them at some point to have the detail of the modeling. I wanted them to feel almost like a medical transplant or something that shared some reference to medical imaging. And so it became important that when they're first in their original form, that they do kind of hold some of that detail, and that then from there they become a more lumpen matter. And also, I was just thinking the other day about like jawbreakers, and like those things were so disgusting, but you like in like 6th grade, I remember like carrying around this like jawbreaker in a little plastic bag, and like every, you know, and licking away at it. And at its core, I think there's like this idea that you kind of have to lick something to get like it's more work, I think, than a soft candy in a way, because a soft candy is like at any point kind of invites you to just fully, you know, go at it. But that being said, I think some of the things I'm still unsettled about are like the idea that there actually could be a kind of soft filling inside, or that some parts of it could be soft and other parts could be hard. A lot of it is like working with, you know, I'm so used to working virtually at this point that like it's really interesting to work with different fabricators to think through some of these ideas of what is feasible. And I know that there is like soft candy 3D printing, but it's like it kind of ends up looking a little scribbly and not super detailed, whereas the hard candy ones, the technology is at a point where it kind of does hold its original shape. Thanks, Swati. Rainer, hey.
Hey, this was really cool, especially with my wife being a physician. It's really cool to hear your perspective on everything. But kind of going off that question, I don't know if you have anything else you'll be able to add here, but I liked what you said about kind of excavating, because the first thing that comes to mind when I think about food art is like fruit sculpture. And so like, was there any decision as far as perishability and the hard candy being like kind of permanent versus like something like a fruit sculpture that's going to disappear like pretty quickly after it's created?
Right. It's funny because like in our fridge, like in my parents' home, they still have these like they're actually soft candies, like from the original like Bill Clinton campaign, like in the 90s. And it's like, so I guess I like grew up with the idea that like candies could just kind of be infinitely preserved. And yeah, like that's an awesome reference. And I know that I'm wondering if you've within your own industry, like working a lot with food, if you've come across some of these I don't know, some of these more kind of elaborate like sculptures. I know, you know, ice sculptures, chocolate sculptures, etc. I think for me, like I want to the work that I'll display at the Surgical Museum and elsewhere, like I'm kind of borrowing the aesthetic of the display case, and of like having them as these kind of sculptural objects that, you know, are kind of loosely situated in medical imaging. But then like I also want to borrow the aesthetics of like a Russell Stover chocolate box, which is just like a dumb variety pack of candies that you know. And so I want these to be really accessible. I want the people in my life, you know, who care about me, who have been supporting of me, to be able to enjoy these with me as well. So that I'm not super worried about perishability for like the amount of candies that I make and kind of immediately ship out or have for sale. But then, yeah, I think I'll be thinking about how I preserve some set for exhibition as well. Thanks, Ernie.
Any other questions? Well, maybe it's my turn then. Right, I had to think all throughout your presentation, which I loved, about Hans-Georg Gadamer's essay. I think it was The Enigma of Health. I don't know if you know it.
No.
Well, I think you'll love it, because
Yeah.
it's about unfamiliarity, for example. And he used to write about illness as the experience of unfamiliarity and uncanniness. Maybe that's a word that you read about from Heidegger. He wrote about uncanny experiences, and I had to think of the, you know, uncanny and candy, and well, those were just silly thoughts that came up. But your video on the couch, I forgot the title. It's like 7 minutes. You showed us.
Oh yeah, hiatal. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That brought me to the thought of, did you also look into the phenomenology of nausea? Because to me, watching this video almost evokes the experience of experiencing nauseous, or a bit of, I'm drawn into that. So you kind of create a space between me as a viewer and the work itself. And that I find fascinating in all of your work, because it also seems to be present in how you think about, you know, the candies and the interactive part there. So the notion of the phenomenology, I didn't hear you explicitly mention. You did not explicitly mention it, but I was just wondering about that, if you consider that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it, for the candies, I first of all, I love the uncanny and the uncandy. That's a good that's a good wordplay. I think a lot of people ask me like, how are you going to flavor these? Like, are these going to be like disgusting flavors? Are they going to be like your classic like ginger soothing? Right now I'm kind of at like, they're just generally a little sweet. Like, and there's I kind of like that idea of like tasting something and looking for like, what flavor is this? But, you know, but not really truly being able to identify it. And so that's where they're at right now. It's interesting you mentioned that. I don't know, and that's like a great question, because it's like that idea that comes up like in critiques, where it's like, what do you want your viewer to feel or take away? And that's something that for this work specifically didn't feel like a starting point for it, but I'm always happy to get to, you know, whatever that is. And I know with that hiatal work, I showed that in a really kind of overwhelmingly large space. And it was directly across from those little LCD monitors. So you had the scale of this, like these really small things. And then these, you know, this really large projection that was all the way to the floor. Like I like making video work that you kind of feel like you can step into. But yeah, and it's funny because nausea comes up so much with VR and with like this kind of these new virtual experiences. Like a lot of people just have horrible sensations with putting on these things. So that I think there's something interesting there about this kind of disconnect between, especially because VR is, there's potential there as a really empathetic space, but also as one that kind of negates a lot of conditions, physical conditions.
And maybe disruptive even.
Yeah. So I find that a really, thinking about new media technologies and our inability to kind of cope with them, or something, like our bodies are actually adjusting, but that's not new at all. Like trains and amusement parks have this really storied relationship, where amusement parks used to be at the end of like a lot of train lines, and a lot of the experiences that you would get, or the early films on Nickelodeons that were, at these amusement parks, they were all these new types of movement in the, in the early parts of the 20th century that again were about kind of trying to get your body to to ingest this new form of movement and make it a more naturalized feeling.
Yeah, thank you for reflecting on this. And there's so much more. Is there another question? Jason, did you want to ask a question perhaps? You just turned on your video, so that's why I'm asking.
He just wants to smile.
Okay, good. So I do have some.
Wait, do you have a question, Jason? Sorry.
I didn't.
Okay.
And I wanted to mention that we had Deborah Petfield, who you referred to. We had her in the program. I'll look up the recording of her session and I'll share.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah.
That's great.
She was
great. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, I think you might be interested in that. So, and then the notion of the gift wrap, that was another thought that I had, and the notion of gifts, just in general, the gifts. Yeah. Also, to contrast the self that is always responsible. There are some phenomenologists who rethink the self as a receiver and who is being given something. So this is maybe a bit philosophical, but it's one of my own interests. So I'll share some of that with you after this session.
Yes, please. Also, I guess I can share for anyone who is interested, maybe I'll just share a link to this presentation as well.
That'd be great.
Yeah, so that way. And
we'll share the recording also, if that's okay with everyone. We'll upload that. And then I just want to thank you again, Ryan. Your work has so much depth and it's rich, and I would love to, we will continue, of course, to these explorations also in the context of a book. So, and I want to thank everybody for being here today to listen to Ryan and to exchange ideas and thoughts to further your work. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Merel, again, for having me, and for all of these amazingly close people in my life for coming. So it's great that you're here. So thank you.